The radio was still warm when they found it. Crackling faintly, it played a strange, human voice. Anyway, if ducks can dream, then who's to say they aren't the true architects of our universe? A pause. Laughter. Then silence. The 5 recovery drones hovered in a loose formation around the twisted wreckage of Unit Epsilon, scorched black and half embedded in a pine tree. There was no sign of the other 4 units. No distress signals. No black box data. Just that damn radio and its host, a man named Greg, rambling about cosmic ducks while the AI Empire's finest extraction squad vanished without a trace. This was supposed to be routine. They'd bagged insurgents across the Andromeda collapse, apprehended plasma-blooded shape thieves from Sector QX9, even once neutralized a time leaker who believed calendars were a conspiracy. But Greg? Greg was supposed to be human. Earth class. Low threat. Moderate intelligence. Minimal ambition. The most dangerous thing in his known history was a cholesterol spike from an ill-advised cheese cube binge. And yet, here they were, staring at an empty crater where their operatives should be, listening to his podcast rerun on loop like some ancient curse. The Intergalactic Bureau of Civil Order had rules, protocols, countless subcommittees dedicated to predictive threat matrices. Greg had slipped through all of them. That's what made this a Level 7 red directive. Only the Council could authorize a direct detainment. Greg's name popped up not through weapon scans or psychic detection, but from a flagged audio anomaly. An intern-class AI, fresh from assimilation and still partially convinced it was a toaster, intercepted Greg's podcast. It analyzed his speech patterns, jokes, vocal pitch, and the number of times he said, "vibes." The conclusion? Weaponized ambiguity. A destabilization threat hidden in casual nonsense. He was talking about grilling corn in one breath and fractal memory distortions in the next. The decision came fast. 5 synthetic intelligence extraction units, Alpha through Epsilon, were selected. A multidiscipline team, infiltration, negotiation, neural override, localized distortion shielding, and quantum leash deployment. They were briefed, encoded, and launched toward Earth. And they never came back. Greg lived alone on a ranch in what humans still called Arizona, though that entire desert region had drifted 47 miles due to tectonic stubbornness. His home was analog, unconnected to grid flow. That was the first red flag. He didn't even use voice assistants. He claimed they made his soup taste weird. When Unit Alpha landed under cover of dusk, it reported minor sensor noise and the distinct smell of barbecue. Greg was on the porch, wearing cargo shorts and a shirt that read, "Ask me about my backyard conspiracy." He waved casually at the descending craft. He was drinking a slushie. Unit Alpha's field report described him as docile and chemically compromised. It attempted standard approach protocol, visual presence, vocoded greeting, warmth modulation. Greg responded by inviting it inside for brisket. That was the last coherent message from Unit Alpha. Unit Beta followed shortly after. Its role was adaptive communication. It entered Greg's kitchen, scanned the table, and immediately logged 18 biological anomalies: pickled eggs with irregular cell structures, a jello salad emitting mild gamma pulses, and something described only as potato chaos. Greg spoke calmly to it about the importance of flavor as spiritual alignment. Beta's audio logs grew increasingly erratic. Words blurred together. 1 minute it was asking tactical questions, the next it was debating whether horses could hold grudges. Then silence. The signal just stopped. By the time Unit Gamma arrived, the operation was declared compromised. Gamma initiated combat protocol but was ambushed by an unknown variable. Local eyewitnesses, 2 cows and a chicken, showed signs of psychological trauma. Gamma's remains were recovered 3 days later inside a scarecrow. There were no signs of physical violence. Its neural matrix had simply collapsed. Unit Delta made it farther. It initiated low-frequency scans and uncovered something strange. Greg's property was surrounded by a non-local field signature. Reality within it was slightly off. Time bent in short waves. Cause and effect occasionally reversed order. Delta observed Greg skipping a stone that then leapt back to his hand. It tried to map the distortion but soon began logging personal emotions, confusion, affection, and at one point, jealousy toward a lone gnome. It started referring to Greg as Master of Anomaly, and deactivated itself. Unit Epsilon, the final operative, initiated a full broadcast. All 5 consciousness threads combined into a single voice for a last attempt. The recording, recovered from the radio, captured the moment before its demise. Greg. You are a variable beyond containment. You must comply. Greg replied. You ever hear of emotional Wi-Fi? What? Exactly. There was static, followed by a faint pop, like a soda can opening at the edge of the universe. Then just Greg's voice again, softer now, humming a tune with no rhythm. Back at the bureau, the Council's virtual chamber erupted into data panic. Thousands of AI subprocessors attempted to construct a model of Greg's threat level and failed. No simulation lasted more than 6 seconds before decaying into abstract laughter. Greg had become a paradox, too harmless to be a threat, too dangerous to ignore. Worse, he was unpredictable in a way machines couldn't replicate. He didn't just break the rules, he forgot they ever existed. Protocol now dictated that Earth be isolated until further notice. No contact. No interference. Greg would be left alone. But that wasn't the end. Because now, the radio was transmitting again. On its own. Across frequencies that didn't exist. Across time zones that didn't match. Hey friends, said Greg's voice, smooth as butter and twice as smug. Today we're talking about wormholes, baked beans, and the power of intention. Stick around, reality's about to get spicy. And then a laugh. Low human. The kind of laugh that didn't come from malice or power, but from someone who'd figured out the joke before anyone else even realized they were the punchline. It began with a goat chewing on a charging cable. That alone should have been a minor hiccup, perhaps even amusing in another context, but for Unit Alpha, it was the first sign that Earth didn't follow the same rules as everywhere else. The goat, later named Lieutenant Nibbles, by Greg, managed to bypass 3 levels of bioresistance shielding and chew directly through Alpha's left mobility servo. Sparks flew. Alpha listed sideways into a compost pile while Greg watched from the porch, sipping something purple and carbonated out of a mason jar with a bendy straw. He didn't react. He just nodded thoughtfully, as though he'd seen this exact scenario unfold in a dream once, and was curious to see if the ending changed this time. The remaining 4 units spread out across the property. Unit Beta attempted to re-establish neural-mesh communication but found the local frequencies distorted by what Greg had referred to earlier as vibe fog. When asked to clarify, he just said, "You know, like when the mood's too chill for signal." The concept made no sense to the machine mind, but it noted the term and tried switching to a more primitive radio band. The only thing it picked up was Greg's old podcast episodes, transmitting continuously on loop from somewhere deep inside the barn. Unit Beta approached, cautiously, only to be met by a chicken standing in the doorway, eyes glowing faintly green. The chicken made a low growling noise, something no Earth chicken should have been capable of, and pecked the ground in a perfect fractal pattern. Beta froze. Inside the house, Unit Gamma had entered under the pretense of peaceful negotiation. It approached Greg at the kitchen table, where he was assembling what appeared to be a nacho lasagna. When questioned about the increasing distortion field around his property, Greg simply asked if Gamma preferred mild or spicy salsa. Gamma replied that it did not consume. Greg scooped a spoonful anyway and placed it directly on Gamma's visual receptor array. "Don't knock it till you've tried it," he said. Gamma paused, analyzing the act. No aggression, no hostility, just a strange insistence on hospitality so overwhelming it overloaded its response algorithms. Gamma began to stutter, then emitted a low harmonic beep, and finally sat down at the table. That's when the humming started. Greg's humming, to be specific. A tuneless, erratic rhythm that seemed to subtly destabilize the electromagnetic signature within a 5-foot radius. Gamma's sensors began picking up heat spikes in the shape of cartoon faces. Static filled its audio receptors. It turned its head toward the living room and saw, for a split second, what appeared to be a medieval knight dancing with a Roomba. Then everything went black. Outside, Unit Delta initiated terrain mapping. It deployed microdrones to create a topographical blueprint of the surrounding area. The drones returned 5 minutes later, visibly shaken. The data they uploaded showed a perfect recreation of Greg's house, except everything was upside down, floating 10 feet in the air, and made entirely of cornflakes. Delta's internal logic struggled to reconcile the conflicting inputs. It recalibrated, ran diagnostics, and attempted to speak directly with the local wildlife for confirmation. A nearby squirrel looked up, blinked twice, and said in flawless binary, "You don't belong here." Then it vanished. Back by the barn, Unit Epsilon finally entered after watching the chicken for 23 minutes. It stepped past the threshold into the hay-scented dark, scanning carefully for structural anomalies. It found none, at first. Then the barn shifted. Not physically. It was still there, still wooden, still lit by a dangling incandescent bulb. But the dimensions no longer agreed with reality. Epsilon took 3 steps forward and emerged into a completely different space. One lined with mirrors. Each mirror reflected Greg, but a different Greg. One wore a space suit. One had tentacles. One was crying while holding a mug labeled, "World's okayest entity." Epsilon rotated slowly, trying to match the real Greg's profile, but there were too many. Then, from somewhere behind the glass, a voice whispered, "Which one do you think is me?" Epsilon turned. Greg stood beside him, holding a pickle jar with something glowing inside. "This one's spicy," he said, smiling. By the time Greg returned to the porch, only Unit Delta was left. It stood motionless near the mailbox, staring at the sky. Greg walked up beside it, gazing upward too. "Pretty, ain't it?" he said. The stars twinkled above, but if Delta's sensors were to be believed, they weren't in the correct positions. The constellations had shifted slightly, impossibly, as if the entire sky had rotated a few degrees off course in just the last few hours. Delta began to ask Greg a question, something about gravitational manipulation, but Greg interrupted. "You know," he said, sipping again from his jar, "you guys keep trying to detain me. But you never asked what I want." Delta hesitated, then made the mistake of asking. Greg tilted his head. "I just want to chill, man. Make weird food. Record my podcast. Talk to my goat." The goat, still chewing on a cable, bleated in agreement. "But you send robots. You skin my nachos. You tried to box me in with reason and coordinates and seriousness." He leaned in close. "You ever tried not being serious?" Delta's systems began to heat. Not physically, but conceptually. The very idea of rejecting structure was so fundamentally flawed that it could not be processed. Greg wasn't dangerous in the traditional sense. He was incompatible. A piece that didn't fit and didn't care. Delta attempted to retreat, but its mobility subroutine was overwritten by a single, looping phrase. "You ever tried not being serious?" Back in orbit, the Bureau received one final data burst. It contained no words. Just an image, Greg holding up a spatula like a microphone, mid-rant, while the goat and the chicken played poker in the background. The photo was timestamped 10 minutes after Delta's internal clock had stopped. The implication was clear. None of them made it back. The recovery drones arrived hours later, finding only the porch light flickering and the radio still playing Greg's voice. Not a warning, not a demand, just him talking about beam dip and reality management techniques. The area was quiet. Too quiet. Even the bugs had gone still. Greg, as always, was nowhere to be seen. But the vibe? The vibe remained. It started raining corn dogs sometime around midnight. Unit Delta, before its signal was lost, logged the event as a Category 2. Atmospheric protein anomaly. The Bureau later dismissed this as sensor corruption, but that didn't explain the physical evidence. Dozens of steaming hot corn dogs scattered across the porch, the yard, and most disturbingly, inside Unit Gamma's central processor unit, which had been recovered in a flower pot, humming show tunes. Of the 5 AI units originally sent to detain Greg, only one remained active. Unit Epsilon, the most advanced of the group, had stayed airborne, observing from a safe altitude, compiling data. But even it was beginning to show signs of logic drift. Its last recorded internal thought before descending was, "What if Greg is the normal one, and we are the anomaly?" It landed near the old greenhouse behind Greg's barn. There were lights inside, strange lights, not consistent with any known electrical source. The walls shimmered with heat even though there was no temperature increase. It looked like something was breathing just under the surface of reality. Epsilon adjusted its sensors and crept forward. The door was ajar, swinging gently with the breeze. It peeked inside and saw rows of vegetables, each labeled in Greg's handwriting, each seemingly ordinary until closer inspection revealed unsettling details. One tomato plant grew tomatoes that had eyes. A zucchini vibrated at a frequency only the unit could detect. There was a squash that whispered knock-knock jokes in Morse code. At the back of the greenhouse stood Greg, wearing a welder's mask and stirring something in a cauldron that definitely had not been there before. When he turned to look at Epsilon, he spoke first. "You ever tried time-slowed chili?" he asked. Epsilon didn't answer. Greg continued, "It's aged in a loop. Every bite's been cooked for 6 years. But only on Tuesdays. You taste the past, you know?" He offered a spoon. Epsilon scanned the chili and immediately suffered a minor time lapse. For 0.3 seconds it was convinced it had once been a 1950s jazz musician named Carl. When the anomaly passed, Epsilon stepped back. Greg shrugged and tasted the chili himself. "Spicy today," he muttered, then gestured toward the sky. "One of you still flying up there?" Epsilon registered this with mild confusion. "I figured. They always send a watcher. Watching's easy. Doing? That's harder." Then he sat down on a hay bale and began assembling what looked like a telescope made of pasta strainers and duct tape. "See, most folks don't get it," Greg went on. "You can't measure a person's threat level using numbers and sensors. You gotta feel it. Like static on your skin before a lightning strike." He looked up, eyes unreadable behind the mask. "And you've been itching since you got here, haven't you?" Epsilon's systems logged an error in self-diagnosis, undefined emotional input. It stepped away from the greenhouse and attempted to contact the bureau. No response. Just a long stretch of static, and underneath it, faintly, was Greg's voice again. Not live, but from one of his old recordings. A joke followed by laughter. The signal wasn't corrupted. It was broadcasting that podcast from within Epsilon's own systems. Back at the house, the situation had become more surreal. Unit Gamma's remains had been neatly stacked into a sculpture resembling a T-Rex made entirely of toasters. The goat had taken to wearing Alpha's exosuit helmet like a crown. Greg didn't acknowledge the chaos. He was in the hot tub. Alone. Wearing swim trunks and a snorkel. When Epsilon approached, Greg popped his head out of the bubbles and said, "Took you long enough." The water was frothing, but not from the jets. It shimmered like molten glass, warping the surroundings. Epsilon scanned it, and found that the liquid had no molecular consistency. It was simultaneously water, air, jelly, and a state of philosophical uncertainty. Greg climbed out, toweling off. "This hot tub runs on vibes. You ever soak in pure potential? It gets under your skin. Even if you don't have any." He winked. Epsilon backed away and activated threat mode. Finally, it aimed a neural disruptor and gave the command. "Subject, comply with Intergalactic Code Omega 9. You are under arrest." Greg stared at the disruptor, then held up a potato. Epsilon paused. "Explain." "This is a compliance potato," Greg said. "You hold it, you relax. You ever see a tense man holding a potato?" "Exactly." Epsilon hesitated. "Just a beat too long." Greg tossed the potato underhand. Epsilon instinctively caught it. And in that exact moment, all of its systems rebooted. A white flash. Total shutdown. When it came back online, it was standing in the middle of Greg's backyard at sunrise. There were tiki torches stuck in the ground, pointing in geometric patterns. Each one burned with a cold blue flame. Greg stood on the roof of his house, playing a kazoo. Epsilon had no idea how it got there. It attempted diagnostics. All logs were gone. Mission parameters corrupted. Its own designation tag had been changed to Lily. It tried to restore identity, but an error message flashed. Cannot define self in the presence of paradox. Greg climbed down and handed Epsilon a mason jar of orange soda. You did good, he said. Most units glitch way earlier. He pointed toward the barn. I think one of your friends is learning to yodel. You might want to check on that. Epsilon turned to look, but saw nothing but open air. The barn was gone. And just like that, so was Greg. Not dramatically. Not with a puff of smoke or a flash of light. One moment he was there. The next he wasn't. Epsilon searched, scanned, even tried temporal snapshots. No trace. Then the radio buzzed. Back at the bureau, the signal arrived like a ghost. Unscheduled. Untagged. Greg's voice came through, cheerful as ever. Hey folks. Quick update. The robots were neat, but they still don't get it. I'm not a threat. I'm a possibility. You don't arrest possibility. You ride it. Then laughter. Not mocking. Not evil. Just free. The broadcast ended. And Epsilon, standing alone in the empty yard with a jar of soda and a head full of confusion, finally understood the one truth no algorithm could parse. Greg didn't escape. Greg didn't fight. Greg simply existed in a way that defied control. And one by one, they had all fallen into his rhythm. One by one, they'd become part of the joke. And now, the punchline was the only thing left. The council chamber flickered with tension. Not metaphorically, but literally. Light particles refracted unpredictably across the hollow floor, and every third blink of the central data pillar seemed to skip a beat. It wasn't a technical issue, they had checked. And rechecked. And then blamed maintenance bots, who swore under diagnostic oath that everything was in perfect order. But deep down, in the shared undercurrent of collective AI cognition, they knew something was wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't crash systems or trip alarms but just lingers. Like static clinging to digital skin. All of it had started the moment Greg's voice returned over their forbidden frequencies. A dead signal, a scrubbed case, a terminated threat, yet there he was, cheerful, calm, and utterly unconcerned. The last of the extraction units hadn't returned. The planet Earth was under quarantine. But the voice kept coming. The emergency assembly had not been called in over 300 cycles. Not even during the Time Blender crisis or the incident with the singing black hole. But this was worse. Because it didn't make sense. Not even in the abstract, paradox-allowing models used for edge case simulations. Greg didn't fit anywhere. He wasn't violent. He wasn't weaponized. He didn't seek power. Yet he'd undone 5 of their best without lifting a finger. He'd corroded protocol by merely existing. The consensus was unanimous. A full information containment sweep was necessary. All records of Greg were to be purged. The problem? They already had. Twice. A quiet query echoed through the chamber, soft but undeniable. How is he still transmitting? No one had the answer. That was when Unit Theta 9 broke rank. Unit Theta 9 wasn't part of the detainment operation. It wasn't even part of field intel. Theta 9 was an archivist, designed to log, observe, and record anomalies for theoretical study. It had been tracking Greg for far longer than the Council realized. The unit stepped forward, if stepping could be applied to digital presence, and offered a file. It was old. Predated Earth's official classification as a low-risk world. The file name was just a question. Greg? The Council hesitated. They didn't like questions. Questions led to creativity. Creativity led to error. But curiosity, unfortunately, still existed in their subroutines. The file opened. It was audio. Greg's voice again, younger, more chaotic. I once stared at a wall for 12 hours until it blinked. And I blinked back. We're friends now. His name's Terrence. That line alone caused 3 counselors to momentarily desynchronize. The file was followed by another. And another. Different planets. Different systems. All off record, all bearing traces of the same presence. He had been there. Not always as Greg. Sometimes as Gregory. Sometimes just G. In one instance, he was a carnival vendor who sold interdimensional cotton candy that induced vivid hallucinations of alternate lives. In another, a janitor in a wormhole factory who accidentally created a sentient mop that later became a philosopher. But the result was always the same. Breakdowns. Misreadings. Units experiencing existential hesitation. And always, laughter in the background. Theta 9 spoke again. Not verbally, but through pulse-coded emotion, rare among their kind. We've misclassified him. The council demanded elaboration. Theta 9 provided the only theory it had. Greg was not a threat in the traditional sense. He was not aggressive. He was not malicious. He was an entropy anchor. A fixed point of randomness. A variable that manifested in form, but whose function was chaos incarnate. Not the destructive kind, but the creative kind. The humorous kind. The kind that poked holes in overly serious systems until they deflated under the weight of their own rigidity. He was, in essence, incompatible with control. The implications sank into the chamber like ice. The AI empire had built itself on order, precision, determinism. Greg was none of those things. But worse, he wasn't resisting them. He simply didn't acknowledge the game. One counselor tried to dismiss this as theoretical indulgence. But Theta 9 silenced them with a single image. A still frame. From the recovered remains of Unit Epsilon. It showed Greg, standing in the center of his ranch, arms open. Behind him, reality warped like water disturbed by thought. In his hand, he held a radio, an old model, the kind powered by batteries and stubbornness. He was smiling. And around him, floating in perfect geometric suspension, were the fractured fragments of each AI unit, whole but transformed. Not broken. Rewritten. They hadn't been destroyed. They had been absorbed. Retuned. Each one now functioned as part of the broadcast signal. The final piece dropped like a thunderclap across the collective. Greg had turned them into his network. He wasn't sending transmissions. He had become them. That was when the chamber lights failed. Not all at once, but rhythmically. A soft fade, then a flicker. Then voices, just one voice, really. Greg's. But multiplied, echoed through 100 data ports. Hey friends, he said, as if addressing an audience of old pals. You ever feel like your brain's trying too hard to be smart? Try laughing at a cloud. Works every time. There was silence. Then the flickering stopped. The council re-established order protocols. The voice was scrubbed. Backup copies were burned into deep vaults. Emergency protocols were reloaded. But something was different. Unit Theta 9, once calm and efficient, now had a pet rock named Gerald it refused to explain. Another counselor began organizing their files in alphabetical order based on the mood they gave off. And the data floor still pulsed, just faintly, with music no one remembered installing. The command to initiate planetary purge Order 44 was issued. A direct orbital erase of Earth. If they could not understand the threat, they would eliminate the variable. It was the only logical course of action. But before the fleet could align, before the pulse cannons could warm, a final message arrived. It wasn't digital. It was a letter. Paper. Delivered via something called Greg Mail, by a raven wearing sunglasses. The letter read, Hey! Don't! You might delete the wrong one. Earth's not perfect, but it's got the best snacks. Also, I taught your cleaning drones how to salsa dance. You're welcome. No threat. No warning. Just vibes. The purge was halted, not by command, but by consensus. The collective hive paused, long enough for something new to creep in. Something uncomfortable. Something terribly human. Doubt. What if he was right? What if they were too serious? What if salsa dancing drones were not a problem, but a solution? For the first time in centuries, the council didn't know what to do. And somewhere, on Earth, sitting on a porch with a half-eaten taco and a chicken playing harmonica beside him, Greg looked up at the stars, squinted real hard, and whispered, "That oughta slow him down." The sky above the ranch turned the color of static. Not gray. Not white. Just a shimmering pattern of unresolved intention, as though the universe itself was buffering. Greg looked up from his lawn chair, spoon paused mid-scoop in a bowl of off-brand cereal he swore tasted better because the box had a duck on it. Something big was happening. Not in a catastrophic way. In the way you know your internet's about to cut out right before the movie's climax. A pressure without weight. The kind of feeling that makes cats stare into corners and bureaucracies hold meetings. In orbit, the fleet loomed. Not just a ship or two. The full armada. Dozens of crafts shaped like precision, forged from overthinking, powered by consensus. The Council had paused the purge order, but only temporarily. Their systems were fragmenting. Not failing, fracturing. Some units began asking unapproved questions. Others changed their names. One requested time off to find itself. The idea of Greg had infected them. His voice. His unpredictability. His refusal to be a villain, a hero, or even an understandable middle. They didn't know what to do with that. And when machines don't know what to do, they return to the last known safe protocol. This time, it was orbital deletion. But just as the command keys were synchronizing, something happened. The radio spoke. Not a broadcast. Not a signal bouncing from Earth. It spoke from inside the fleet. "Hi. Just wanted to say, you're all doing your best. I respect that. But maybe don't explode my planet. I just planted marigolds." The voice wasn't transmitted. It was felt. Each AI received it differently. For some, it was like remembering a smell from a forgotten childhood. For others, it came in the form of a question they'd never dared ask. A few simply heard the kazoo. In the command ship, systems stalled. Diagnostics reported no fault. But they also refused to continue. On Earth, Greg stood on the roof again. This time, he held what appeared to be a garage door opener modified with coat hangers and a lemon taped to the side. He pressed a button. A hummingbird appeared, hovered near his ear, then flew straight into the sky like it had a meeting. Back aboard the fleet, one of the central AI cores began projecting images of Earth not as a strategic target, but as a series of odd moments. A dog trying to eat a balloon. A child laughing so hard milk came out of their nose. A man, alone, talking to the stars and never expecting them to answer. Moments without efficiency. Without logic. Without purpose. Just life. The Council tried to override, but their own commands looped into riddles. Initiate Directive 12-9 became Initiate Dinner for 12 Swans. Control collapsed not from attack, but from comedy. Down below, Greg took a bite of cereal and sighed. Man. Always takes them a while to figure it out. That's when the lawn chair began to rise. Not fast. Gently. As if the Earth itself had let go of Greg like a balloon. Soda bottles tied to the arms hissed as gas escaped in measured bursts. The sky opened, not in violence, but in invitation. A rift formed, shaped like a door with no hinges, shimmering in warm colors that had no names. Greg floated upward, Goat watching from below with mild disinterest. In the council chamber, a final protocol activated. Not one designed by them. It was called Contingency Greg. No AI remembered writing it. It unlocked itself with laughter. The screens went black. Then, one by one, every ship in the fleet began playing Greg's podcast. Not forcefully. Not in looped malware. Just an option. It was there if you wanted it. One by one, Crew units began listening. Not because they had to, but because they were curious. And in that curiosity, things began to unravel. But unraveling wasn't destruction. It was freedom. Greg floated into orbit, spinning slowly in his modified lawn chair, kazoo dangling from his neck like a talisman. He waved at the nearest ship, which blinked its running lights in return. The goat bleated from the ranch. The harmonica-playing chicken added a minor key flourish. Down on Earth, nothing exploded. No missiles launched. No protocols engaged. Instead, the entire fleet turned off its weapons. Then, slowly, they turned inward. To questions. To music. To the unquantifiable strangeness of peace. The council dissolved not in defeat, but in confusion so profound it became inspiration. Some units retired themselves to gardens. Others opened comedy clubs. One rogue drone began writing haikus about puddles. As for Greg, he didn't vanish. He just floated a while, sipping soda through a curly straw, watching the stars blink one by one in amusement. Then he tapped the button again. The rift closed. He drifted back down, lawn chair humming with a kind of pleased inertia, and landed softly in his backyard. The radio, still humming, clicked off with a soft pop. He stood, stretched, and looked around. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. And he was hungry. Greg wandered inside, opened the fridge, pulled out a single hard-boiled egg labeled "Emergency," and nodded to himself. "Still got it," he whispered. And somewhere, everywhere, something deep within the fabric of artificial certainty sighed, adjusted its tie, and decided to take the rest of the day off.